Mexico is quietly overtaking America's power. The moment America realized it wasn't in control anymore. The sound that marked the shift wasn't an explosion, it was silence. Inside a steel plant outside Detroit, the machines had stopped humming. Conveyor belts sat motionless under flickering lights. Workers stood around, waiting for parts that never came. Across the border in Monterrey, though, the air vibrated with motion. Assembly lines buzzed. Forklifts darted like bees between stacks of half-finished car frames. The contrast was so sharp you could almost hear it through the television broadcast. Even if no one said it out loud, industry had moved south. Here's the twist most people missed. Everyone's eyes were locked on Beijing. News anchors obsessed over tariffs, sanctions, and trade wars in the Pacific. But while America argued about China, its supply chains quietly withdrew themselves just a few hundred miles below Texas. In 2023, U.S. Customs data captured something extraordinary for the first time in modern trade history. Mexico had overtaken China as America's #1 trading partner. Not by a fraction, not by accident, by design, and almost nobody noticed. The headlines never came because this wasn't one dramatic collapse. It was thousands of boring business decisions accumulating into something profound. Every one of those decisions said the same thing: America would rather depend on Mexico than risk another supply disruption from across the ocean. The pandemic shattered the illusion of control. Shipping containers stuck off Los Angeles, semiconductors stranded in Asian ports. Suddenly, proximity wasn't just convenient, it was survival. Nearshoring wasn't a policy, it was an instinct. To understand how we got here, you have to sit with that first moment of quiet in Detroit. That silence wasn't just a production hiccup, it was a symbol. For the first time since the mid-20th century, America didn't own the core of its own industrial momentum. The hum had migrated. Trucks full of parts now crossed the Rio Grande instead of the Pacific. And those parts didn't just feed American factories, they sustained them. The map of power had started rotating south. Get this, Mexico didn't make any grand announcement. No Make Mexico the World's Factory campaign. No new economic doctrine. The transformation unfolded like groundwater seeping under a door. American automakers began moving final assembly to Baja California. Electronics giants quietly expanded in Ciudad Juarez. Data centers and warehouse parks sprang up along highways that used to lead nowhere. When analysts finally tallied the numbers, they realized Mexico had become indispensable to America's survival economy. And yet it didn't look like a takeover. It looked like cooperation, at least at first. The factories were American-owned, the blueprints American-drawn, the financing American-approved. But the labor, infrastructure, and logistical control lay squarely on Mexican soil. That's where the story bends. Because when you hand over your production lines, you hand over a piece of your leverage. Every company that relocated south to cut costs was unknowingly building the economy that could one day compete with them for control of North America. Take 2023. While American broadcasters analyzed inflation charts, freight routes were shifting overnight. 10,000 trucks a day rumbled through Laredo, each one a thread in a new economic web. Inside those containers, microchips from Guadalajara, auto components from León, and solar inverters built in Tijuana. Mexico wasn't just exporting goods, it was exporting reliability. That was the real currency. Reliability after a decade of chaos. Why did this happen under everyone's nose? Because it didn't fit the narrative of a rivalry. There was no conflict, no us versus them, only contracts quietly rewritten. A new industrial map emerged that still bore American logos, but the heartbeat belonged to Mexico. Engineers in Monterrey designed chips for Silicon Valley. Aerospace parts built in Querétaro flew to assembly plants in Kansas. Even the coffee machines in Manhattan offices traced their wiring back to factories in Reynosa. It turned into a North American ecosystem, except now Mexico was the lungs. America just breathed what flowed north. By the time Washington realized it needed to secure its own manufacturing base, Mexico had already become it. Politicians called for re-industrialization, but their supply chains were still drawn through Mexican ports. When tariffs hit China, Mexico's exports to the U.S. spiked again, almost as if the system anticipated the change. Quiet evolution had outmaneuvered grand strategy. Meanwhile, Mexico's cities thrived under this invisible momentum. Monterrey's skyline filled with cranes. Guadalajara's tech parks began calling themselves the Silicon Valley of Latin America. In Tijuana, entire districts converted from maquiladoras to smart factories using automation and AI. They weren't merely chasing American contracts anymore. They were learning, iterating, adapting faster than the corporations who'd arrived to outsource. And that's where concern turns into irony. American companies thought they were de-risking global supply chains by moving closer to home. In reality, they were transferring dependency from Asia to their own neighbor. The supply chain thread now ran north-south, not east-west. Once the new routes were built, redundancy vanished. Everything autos, electronics, medical devices, even solar panels passed through Mexican hubs. If one stopped, half the U.S. economy would stutter. And unlike Beijing, Mexico didn't need to flex power to have influence. Its geography did the heavy lifting. The climax came quietly, Department of Commerce spreadsheets not breaking news. Charts showing how trade with Mexico hit record highs while shipments from China plunged. America hadn't been outmaneuvered in a boardroom or a battlefield, but in the slow math of shipping times and wage differentials. 4 days trucking versus 4 weeks on a container ship, $4.90 an hour versus $30. Those numbers rewrote power dynamics in silence. So when American steel plants stopped and Mexican lines kept running, it wasn't a coincidence. It was destiny grinding forward one procurement order at a time. Everyone had been so focused on China's rise that they missed the continent's own reshaping. A reshaping that didn't come from conflict or conquest, but from the passive momentum of interdependence. And now, it's locked in. That's the mystery we're about to unravel. How America spent decades building a system that would one day make its own dominance optional. Because behind every humming factory floor in Mexico lies an uncomfortable question. If your prosperity depends on your neighbor's efficiency, who really holds the power? To answer that, we need to rewind. Back to the chaos after the pandemic, when the first hints of desperation sent corporate planners searching for safety. Somewhere between broken ports and political standoffs, America drew its contingency plan, and Mexico turned that contingency into opportunity. This is the story of how a country quietly became the new heart of North American industry, and how the United States might have built its own successor without realizing it. The hidden beginning of the nearshoring boom. It started as damage control. In 2021, American companies were still staggering from the supply chain collapse. Cargo ships stacked up at West Coast ports, factories ran out of chips, and the phrase lead time turned toxic in every boardroom. Companies that once bragged about global scale suddenly wanted closeness. Executives didn't use the word nearshoring yet, they said resilience, redundancy, regionalization. All fancy ways to say, we need to stop being one storm away from disaster. Freight costs from Asia had quadrupled. Products that used to take 30 days to ship now took 90. Every container delay meant a production shutdown somewhere in America. That's when planners began circling one country on the map, Mexico. It sat right there inside existing trade frameworks with bilingual engineers, open land, and trucking routes so short they felt like lifelines. None of these moves made headlines at first. They were whispered decisions, contracts tweaked, suppliers swapped, test orders routed through Monterrey instead of Shanghai. By 2022, the quiet experiment started to snowball. American brands discovered their orders from Mexico were arriving on time, even when Asian ports were clogged. Logistics managers noticed something else. Once the trucks hit Laredo or Brownsville, customs clearance took hours, not weeks. That speed turned into leverage. A product assembled in Mexico could hit U.S. store shelves faster than anything made in China. The miracle wasn't technology, it was geography rediscovered. Northern Mexico became the testing ground for this new manufacturing logic. Cities like Tijuana, Reynosa, Chihuahua, and Monterrey exploded with activity. Empty industrial parks turned into humming compounds of metal stamping, wiring harnesses, and advanced electronics assembly. What had once been low-cost maquiladoras evolved into complex operations with robotics, sensors, and lean management systems copied straight from Detroit. Investors followed fast. Foreign direct investment hit a record $21.4 billion in the first quarter of 2025, according to Mexico's Ministry of Economy. Even more revealing, 80% of that money wasn't new. It was reinvestment, companies doubling down on existing Mexican operations. That detail tells the real story. The pioneers had tried nearshoring and discovered it worked too well to stop. DRZ analysts called it the quiet boom. There was no single catalyst, no declaration of intent. It was the accumulation of 1,000 corporate survival instincts. When reporters finally asked why everything from furniture to semiconductors was suddenly coming from across the border, executives gave vague answers about efficiency. But behind those euphemisms lay fear. Fear of another pandemic-scale shutdown, fear of geopolitical escalation, fear of watching their trillion-dollar supply chains drown at sea. A logistics director from a major retail brand later admitted off-record, "We didn't move to Mexico because it was cheaper. We moved because it was reachable." That sentence became the unofficial motto of nearshoring. The point wasn't cost savings, though those came naturally. It was about control. Every factory mile closer meant less exposure, fewer things that could go wrong. That logic spread faster than anyone could map it. Construction firms couldn't pour concrete fast enough for the new industrial zones cropping up near the border. Industrial real estate investment trusts like Vesta expanded land banks along major trade arteries, anticipating years of tenant demand. Trucking companies upgraded fleets, regional airports renovated cargo terminals. The entire northern corridor of Mexico transformed into an extension of the U.S. industrial belt, except it was technically foreign soil. Meanwhile, China's manufacturing slowdown made the transition look prophetic. While US commentators debated decoupling, production lines were already relocating. Asian suppliers set up subsidiaries in Mexico rather than risk tariffs. Ironically, much of the new North American manufacturing still relied on Chinese capital and know-how. It just wore a Mexican label and passed through a duty-free checkpoint. That's why this transformation flew under Washington's radar. The trade numbers looked patriotic, the supply chains less so. For Mexican communities, the shift felt like an unexpected second industrial revolution. Towns once defined by migration to the US were now receiving workers instead of losing them. Pay wasn't high by American standards, but it was stable, and factories offered benefits unheard of a decade earlier. Technicians earned enough to afford homes near the plants. Restaurants popped up to serve the new shift schedules. In cities like Monterrey, property prices surged as multinational workforces arrived with long-term contracts. By late 2024, logistics companies called Mexico the new China just 2 days away. That phrase spread through industry conferences like a prophecy fulfilled. American CEOs started visiting the border regions again, some for the first time since NAFTA's early days. They discovered advanced automation lines, not sweatshops. Factories with 3D printing labs, bilingual engineers, and digital inventory systems linked straight to their US headquarters. Nearshoring wasn't about retreating into regionalism. It was modernization disguised as hedging. And yet the boom stayed strangely quiet in the public imagination. There were no ticker-tape parades or national speeches in Mexico City, no inflammatory rhetoric in Washington. The story hid behind routine trade statistics camouflaged by familiarity. Americans heard "Made in Mexico" and thought back to 199's outsourcing. Few realized this time Mexico wasn't just taking assembly jobs, it was absorbing strategy. Each factory built south of Texas became a pressure valve for an overextended superpower. Every conveyor belt humming in Saltillo or Querétaro reduced the shock that a disrupted Pacific route could deliver. Piece by piece, America redistributed its industrial nervous system. And once those connections formed, undoing them became impossible without shutting parts of the US economy down. That's why historians might someday call this the most important unannounced shift of the decade. While politicians obsessed over symbolic tariffs on China, the true reordering of North American power happened by osmosis. Mexico didn't lobby for it. The US engineered it through necessity. The pandemic didn't just crack global trade, it handed Mexico a blueprint for partnership that looked temporary but proved permanent. By the early months of 2025, the pattern was too broad to ignore. Mexico's manufacturing GDP ticked up again despite sluggish national growth. Analysts noted consistent export gains even as international demand faltered elsewhere. When asked why, economists answered with a shrug: nearshoring. It became both explanation and excuse, shorthand for an evolution hiding in plain sight. Looking back now, that's where the revolution truly began, not with patriotic slogans or government plans, but in spreadsheets, shipping schedules, and late-night phone calls between procurement managers desperate to keep the lights on. The crisis created the opportunity, and Mexico took it. Quietly, efficiently, permanently. Why American industry turned south? At first glance, it looked like simple arithmetic. American workers earned around $30 an hour. Mexican workers made less than $5. Shipping a container from Asia took weeks, trucking it from Monterrey took days. On a spreadsheet, the decision seemed almost insultingly obvious: move production closer, save time and money, and cut the risks that wrecked balance sheets during the pandemic. But underneath that neat math was something deeper, a psychological shift in how corporate America defines security. For decades, efficiency meant stretching supply chains across oceans. Managers chased the lowest wage anywhere on the planet. But by 2021, that logic felt toxic. Cheapest no longer meant smart. Executives wanted resilience, not miracles by sea freight. They needed factories that stayed online even when global shipping burned down. Mexico, almost by accident, became the answer. It offered cheap labor without transoceanic distance, stable institutions without the political opacity of China, and thanks to the USMCA, tariff-free access to the United States for everything produced under the right rules of origin. Those rules mattered more than anyone admitted. The updated trade agreement guaranteed that if North American content made up 75% of a product's value, it crossed borders duty-free. That clause turned Mexico into a loophole large enough to drive an entire industrial renaissance through. A car built in Coahuila could qualify as North American, even if many subcomponents had traveled halfway around the world before assembly. For U.S. corporations, that meant compliance without compromise. They could keep global sourcing flexibility while appearing patriotic. Then came the comparative shock. American manufacturing wages averaged more than 6 times higher than Mexico's. Even after recent minimum wage hikes, a skilled technician in Nuevo León earned about $4.90 an hour. The math told a ruthless story. A single shift in Mexico cost less than one worker in Michigan. Add to that electricity rates almost 30% lower and labor regulations that allowed flexible scheduling, and suddenly the numbers rewrote themselves. The same firms that once swore domestic production was strategic quietly penciled new facilities south of the border. Shipping sealed the deal. A factory in Tijuana could deliver finished goods to Texas retailers in 48 hours. From Shenzhen to Long Beach, that journey took at least 25 days, not counting customs delays. When every week of transit equaled another week of uncertainty, those lost days became intolerable. Supply chain strategists started talking about the speed dividend, the hidden profit of proximity. Products reached customers faster, inventories shrank, and executives slept better. The cost difference alone was enough to make global distance feel like a liability instead of an advantage. But the shift wasn't purely logistical, it was geopolitical. After years of sparring with China, Washington reframed trade as national security. The phrase security shoring entered policy briefings, a hybrid idea that mixed economics with defense. Mexico wasn't only convenient, it was safe territory under the US umbrella. Within that zone, investments wouldn't be trapped by sanctions or embargoes. For corporations exposed to Asian instability, North America suddenly looked like a fortress. By mid-decade, investors noticed something striking. Mexican equities had nearly doubled in US dollar terms since 2021, yet valuations hadn't expanded. Earnings, not speculation, drove the surge. That meant industrial profits were real, grounded in output rather than hype. Analysts called it resilient growth with no re-rating, a polite way of saying the world hadn't caught on yet. Beneath surface volatility, tariff announcements, border politics, campaign speeches, the fundamentals stayed rock solid. Mexico's rise didn't need optimism. It ran on inevitability. Executives framed it as partnership. They said moving south would strengthen North America as a whole, and on paper that sounded true. But every new assembly line below the Rio Grande transferred a slice of leverage away from the United States. Mexico controlled more of the inputs, the logistics, and the pace of production. A strike near Monterrey could ripple through Detroit within days. The dependency was symmetrical in theory, asymmetrical in reality. America needed the flow of goods north more than Mexico needed a guarantee of demand. They already had it. Consider autos the backbone of continental trade. Vehicles assembled in Mexico qualified for U.S. sale under USMCA provisions as long as enough of their content was regional. That encouraged U.S. carmakers to expand south rather than rebuild dormant plants at home. By 2025, Mexico had become the fifth largest vehicle producer in the world. Assembly lines in Puebla and Guanajuato churned out models wearing American badges but stamped with Mexican VIN numbers. Labor unions in the Midwest grumbled that reshoring had been redefined out of existence. In electronics, the pattern repeated. Over $100 billion in annual exports flowed north, flat-screen televisions, computers, and circuit boards, most of them made within a day's drive of the U.S. border. Companies like Samsung, Foxconn, and Jabil invested billions to modernize facilities in Guadalajara and Ciudad Juarez. The workforce followed. 125,000 engineering graduates a year feeding an industrial ecosystem, increasingly indistinguishable from the tech clusters once dominated by Asia. What truly sealed Mexico's role wasn't lower cost, it was predictability. Even with rising wages, they remained well below U.S. levels, but the reliability of truck routes, power grids, and bilingual management created what supply chain planners called functional certainty. In a world where unpredictability had become permanent, certainty was priceless. No major storm, border checkpoint, or tariff decree could freeze operations for long. That stability turned Mexico from a substitute into a cornerstone. Meanwhile, Washington's language betrayed its unease. Officials praised North American competitiveness, but every supportive statement came packaged with anxiety about losing control. Behind closed doors, policymakers admitted they couldn't pressure Mexico too hard without risking self-inflicted pain. 80% of U.S. Mexico trade already flowed within the USMCA framework, beyond the easy reach of unilateral tariffs. The very deal designed to bind neighbors together now constrained American leverage. Inside boardrooms, none of this sounded alarming. It sounded like progress. CFOs presented supply chain maps showing shorter routes and lower risk. Shareholders saw margin expansion. But if you zoomed out, the map told a subtler story. Each arrow pointing south represented not just efficiency gained, but responsibility shifted. The more seamless the integration, the harder it became to tell where one nation's production ended and the other's began. By late 2025, the numbers coalesced into something like momentum physics. The transition couldn't be reversed without enormous cost. Pulling factories back north would trigger shortages, layoffs, and political backlash. Companies were too entangled now, contracts written, warehouses leased, cross-border suppliers locked into just-in-time delivery cycles. The system relied on Mexico not as an optional partner but as a structural element. Remove it and the machine stops. Viewed coldly, Mexico had become America's spare industrial capacity, except it ran full-time and kept the lights on. The comforting phrase was regional integration. The accurate one was quiet dependence. And somewhere between those definitions lay the reason American industry turned south. It wasn't greed or betrayal or ideology. It was gravity, the pull of geography, economics, and necessity dragging production to the only place that could shoulder the weight. For the United States, that gravity carried a cost. The more they leaned on Mexico for resilience, the more fragile their autonomy became. Every truck crossing the border whispered the same paradox. Bringing supply chains closer also meant surrendering control of them. Step by step, contract by contract, America built a safety net that doubled as a leash. And as the shipments increased, that leash tightened, not abruptly, but continuously, the way quiet transformations always do. Factories of the future, Mexico's new industrial map. Factories of the future, Mexico's new industrial map. Walk through northern Mexico today and you feel it before you see it. An industrial pulse that started at the border and spread inland like electricity along a circuit. Monterrey's skyline glitters with new glass towers crowned by tech logos. Tijuana's hillsides hum with the glow of assembly plants running through the night. Ciudad Juarez, once written off as a border outpost, now ships millions of electronic devices across the Rio Grande every month. Thousands of containers roll through crowded checkpoints daily, carrying the evidence of an economic metamorphosis no one quite declared, but everyone now depends on. Each region of Mexico found its role in this new order. Monterrey became the powerhouse, a city long known for steel and beer quietly reinvented into a hub for advanced manufacturing. Dozens of multinational firms, Siemens, Jabil, and TE Connectivity among them, set up sprawling campuses there. Lines of robotic arms twist and pivot in near silence, monitored by young engineers analyzing data in spotless control rooms. The city's university graduates feed directly into these plants, bridging software and hardware in a way that blurs where production ends and design begins. Regional planners call Monterrey the anchor of the new industrial triangle, linking energy, logistics, and export power in one continuous network. Farther west, Guadalajara wears a different badge. The locals call it Mexico's Silicon Valley, and it's earned that nickname. Decades of electronics experience have evolved into something near future grade. Inside Flextronics' vast campus, circuit boards for cars, computers, and medical equipment flow down automated lines shielded by glass walls. Siemens runs a center there testing renewable energy components for both American and European markets. The city exports brains as much as products. Thousands of engineers coding firmware, designing boards, fine-tuning the machines that make everything else run. By 2025, Mexico had become the world's third largest exporter of computers, with Guadalajara at the heart of it. To the north, the twin cities of Tijuana and Ciudad Juarez anchor the border's manufacturing highway. Their industrial parks stretch for miles, cavernous buildings humming with the energy of global brands. Foxconn assembles devices here just as it does in Asia, but at a fraction of the shipping time. Jabil builds automotive electronics that end up in US and Canadian vehicles. Nearly 86% of all Mexican electronics exports head straight to the United States. Flat-screen televisions, communication hardware, industrial sensors, all totaling more than $100 billion annually. That scale pushed Mexico past nearly every regional rival, second only to China in electronics supply to the US, and the gap keeps narrowing. Behind these headline industries lies a web of logistics connecting everything like veins in a living system. Highways from Chihuahua link to rail lines cutting through Tamaulipas, then to the Gulf ports feeding Texas. In the span of 2 days, a component fabricated inland can sit in a U.S. distribution center. That temporal compression, measured not in miles but in hours, turns geography into strategic advantage. Supply chain analysts estimate that for every $100 million project, proximity to U.S. markets saves between $5 and $7 million a year in logistics and inventory costs. Those aren't marginal savings, they're structural ones. Technology amplified that gain. More than a third of Mexico's electronics manufacturing service providers now run Industry 4. Systems, integrating automation, AI-driven quality control, and network sensors. Workers wear smart devices tracking productivity and safety in real time. Digital twins simulate production runs before physical machines even move. That leap in sophistication erased the last stereotype of the low-cost assembler. Today's maquiladora zones look more like miniature space programs than sweatshops. It's not just a change in machinery but in identity, Mexico moving from cheap labor to strategic capability. None of this happened in a vacuum. Policy followed where momentum led. The Sheinbaum administration launched Plan Mexico, a blueprint of 15 tax-incentivized industrial corridors designed to lock in the nearshoring boom. Stretching from the northeast border to the central highlands, each corridor aligns with a priority sector: automotive in Coahuila, aerospace in Querétaro, logistics in Veracruz, electronics in Jalisco. The plan pairs tax incentives with infrastructure promises: new energy lines, renewable power commitments, and expanded highways. By pledging to double clean energy capacity by 203, from 80 to 156 terawatt-hours, the government signaled that the future factories of North America would run on Mexican electrons as well as Mexican labor. Investors responded instantly. The electronics sector alone pulled in roughly $12 billion in foreign direct investment during 2025, much of it from reinvested profits. Real estate developers like Vesta expanded faster than contractors could pour foundations, using their Route 203 plan to pre-lease industrial parks in Monterrey, Guadalajara, and Mexico City long before construction finished. Analysts joke that it's the only time in recent memory when supply struggled to keep up with supply chains themselves. But the numbers only hint at how deeply this restructuring reaches into daily life. Walk through a facility in Reynosa and you'll notice the accents. Operators switching seamlessly between Spanish and English, tablet screens coded from software teams in Guadalajara, instruction videos subtitled for visiting engineers from Michigan. The integration is cultural as much as economic. For younger Mexican engineers, the old aspiration to go north has flipped. They stay home, building products that cross the border without them. Towns once dependent on remittances now run on paychecks earned in high-tech factories. The automotive sector exemplifies the transformation scale. By 2025, Mexico ranked as the fifth largest vehicle producer on Earth, rivaling Japan and Germany for export diversity. Its plants assemble internal combustion engines, electric vehicles, and hybrid systems for virtually every global brand. Firms like General Motors, Stellantis, and Toyota expanded Mexican capacity to meet strict U.S. emission targets while keeping costs manageable. The ripple effects stretch through secondary suppliers: metal stamping, battery pack assembly, electronic control modules, all thriving in border clusters that function as an unspoken continuation of the U.S. Midwest industrial belt. And yet there's an undercurrent of tension inside the success story. Growth that fast rewires dependencies. Every new automation line in Chihuahuan deserts tightens American reliance on Mexican infrastructure, power grids, trucking routes, even water supply. Logistics planners whisper about the single-point exposure, a polite phrase for too much concentration risk. If a single state suffers a strike, blackout, or flood, production halts across multiple U.S. industries within days. North America's industrial resilience increasingly begins, and therefore can break south of the border. That interdependence gives Mexico quiet leverage it's never wielded before. Policymakers in Washington praise regional integration while quietly modeling worst-case scenarios of border shutdowns. Companies structure insurance clauses around it. Meanwhile, Mexican officials project confidence, framing their nation not as a subcontractor, but as the backbone of continental productivity. Behind speeches about friendship lies a subtle power equation. The U.S. may set the consumer demand, but Mexico now holds the production throttle. And it's not stopping at assembly. Research and development centers are multiplying near the new plants, closing the loop between innovation and output. Guadalajara's campuses are designing chips, not just soldering them. Monterrey's universities host joint programs with American partners on AI-driven manufacturing. Even smaller cities, San Luis Potosi, Chihuahua, Mexico City, are emerging as specialized clusters for electric vehicle components and medical technology. The map of Mexican industry no longer hugs the border. It sprawls deep into the interior, forming a lattice of technical expertise that will be hard for any competitor or customer to unwind. So when analysts speak of factories of the future, they're not describing prototypes still on drawing boards. They're talking about the network already humming across Mexico right now, automated, green-powered, and algorithmically managed. It stands as both proof and warning, the fulfillment of America's regional dream and the start of its dependence. Because every new machine powered up in Monterrey sends a quiet signal northward. The center of gravity in North American manufacturing has migrated. Not through conquest or decree, but through competence, reliability, and proximity. And as the hum deepens across Mexico's industrial heartland, the paradox sharpens. The very systems designed to make America more secure against global shocks have planted the heart of its resilience beyond its borders. The factories of the future are already built, and they're running on Mexican time. The backdoor problem. For a while, everything looked stable. The U.S. got faster, cheaper supply chains through Mexico, and officials in Washington framed it as a win for regional security. Then came the suspicion that wouldn't go away, that maybe someone else was using the very same network for their own advantage. Beneath the rhetoric of "Made in North America," Chinese factories were quietly finding a way back into the American market through the side door Mexico had unwittingly opened. It began with a few eyebrow-raising investment announcements. A cluster of Chinese electric vehicle startups suddenly planned major assembly plants in northern Mexico, names almost unknown in the United States, promising to serve Latin American markets. The projects looked innocuous, until trade analysts noticed they lined up directly with logistical corridors pointing straight at Texas. On paper, they weren't exporting to the US, but their parts list told another story. The same models sold in China appearing a few months later in American dealerships under different sub-brands. The suspicion sounded paranoid until Commerce Department data started confirming it. Components and sub-assemblies of Chinese origin flowing into Mexico, finished goods flowing out, all stamped with USMCA-compliant paperwork. For US policymakers who had spent years erecting tariff walls against Beijing, this loophole was infuriating. They de-built a fence that led straight back into the house. Under the USMCA, anything meeting 75% regional value content crossed duty-free, and enforcement focused on the final product, not every bolt and chip. That rule turned Mexico's industrial boom into an unintentional shield for Chinese value chains. Every car assembled in Coahuila with imported batteries or transmissions risked being, in economic terms, a relabeled Chinese import. Business leaders in Mexico rejected the accusation. They pointed out that most of the investors creating jobs were legitimate multinationals hedging their global exposure. Yet the optics were impossible to ignore. Trucks full of low-cost EVs leaving Mexican plants while US automakers struggled to meet domestic affordability targets. Detroit executives warned Congress that a new wave of price competition could collapse the home front before their electric transitions even started. Labor unions, still smarting from factory relocations, claimed China was sneaking under the border fence. The panic triggered a policy scramble. Early in 2025, Washington floated the idea of component-level certification, an auditing system to trace every imported module's origin before granting duty-free status. It sounded technical, but in practice it meant slowing down cross-border trade that was supposed to be frictionless. Customs officers would need to verify the source of semiconductors, battery cells, and wiring harnesses, forcing Mexican exporters to prove how much of their content was truly North American. The message was clear. If Chinese input reached beyond an undefined threshold, the whole shipment could face the full 25% tariff. Across the border, Mexican officials viewed the proposal as existential. Their export machine depended on speed, delays equaled cancellations. Industry groups lobbied furiously, warning that excessive enforcement could strangle the very integration Washington demanded. Yet privately they acknowledged the uncomfortable truth: China's financial fingerprints were everywhere. From Foxconn subcontractors to unnamed suppliers in Guadalajara's industrial parks, elements of Chinese capital hid inside seemingly local networks. Not necessarily illegal, but strategically awkward. Then came the diplomatic ripple. In Canada, Ontario's premier hinted that if Mexico continued to function as a backdoor for Chinese goods, Ottawa should reconsider the entire USMCA framework. The quote made its way into every news cycle, instantly politicizing what had been a niche trade concern. A trilateral achievement that once symbolized continental unity now looked fragile. Each partner eyed the others with suspicion, Canada worrying about rules of origin, the US about hidden Chinese content, Mexico about being punished for global investment it couldn't control. Within Mexico, the backlash took on a defensive pride. Commentators argued that the United States was happy to benefit from Mexican labor until it started giving Mexico leverage. You wanted nearshoring, one commentator wrote in Reforma, not purity tests. Industrial leaders reminded Washington that 80% of bilateral trade already occurred under USMCA rules and that any disruption would backfire immediately on US supply chains. The irony was thicker than the border paperwork. After decades of pushing globalization, America was now afraid of its own design working too well. Still, the unease wasn't imaginary. The US intelligence community began classifying certain Chinese investments in Mexican industrial zones as potential security risks. Reports circulated about advanced telecom components and energy storage technology being developed just south of the border with limited oversight. It wasn't espionage, it was integration by default. The closer American companies pulled their supply lines, the easier it became for their geopolitical rivals to slip inside them. Politically, the tension peaked when presidential candidates from both US parties promised to review USMCA enforcement in 2026. Some floated renegotiation, others threatened targeted tariffs on specific Mexican sectors. Economists warned that such moves could destabilize both economies more than they'd protect jobs. But no one could ignore the optics of foreign EVs entering showrooms via trusted partners. The narrative of regional self-reliance had morphed into one of dependence layered with infiltration. On the ground, nearshoring didn't stop. Factories kept humming. Managers shrugged at the headlines, focused on meeting delivery contracts. After all, supply chains obey production schedules, not political speeches. But somewhere deep in the cross-border paperwork, the tone had changed. U.S. importers demanded granular traceability reports. Mexican exporters began sourcing more North American intermediate goods purely to prove compliance. Local suppliers sprang up to fill gaps once supplied from Asia, a forced but beneficial localization. What began as suspicion started to reshape the industrial landscape again, pushing Mexico toward true self-containment inside the continental system. Foreign investors read the mood shift differently. Some Chinese firms rebranded under joint ventures with European or Latin American partners to soften their image. Others quietly redirected shipments to South American markets. The cleansing effect was subtle, a tightening of supply chain purity that ironically made Mexico even more critical to U.S. resilience. The more Washington demanded transparency, the deeper Mexico's production roots grew, because rebuilding that capacity anywhere else in the hemisphere would take years. By late 2025, the backdoor problem had become shorthand in policy circles for the paradox of nearshoring. The very openness that kept continental trade alive also invited the same global competition it was meant to evade. The system couldn't close its gates without suffocating itself. Mexico sat at the center of that paradox, benefiting from both American fear and necessity. Each new regulation aimed at policing Chinese content only reinforced Mexico's position as the indispensable checkpoint for everything entering the richest consumer market on Earth. So where Washington saw vulnerability, Mexico saw validation. The factories might carry foreign capital, but the jobs, taxes, and expertise stayed home. Every accusation of being a backdoor just underscored their new importance. As one Mexican trade official put it behind closed doors, if we're the gateway, someone has to control the gate. That sentence summed up the quiet transformation perfectly. What began as a loophole was becoming a source of leverage, and Washington, realizing this, started watching the door more closely than ever. The price of partnership, USMCA and the wage war. By the time Mexico's factories had become the heartbeat of North American manufacturing, a new kind of tension was forming under the surface, one measured not in tariffs or shipping delays, but in paychecks. At the center of it all stood the very agreement that made this boom possible, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA. When it replaced NAFTA in 2002, Washington sold it as a fairer deal, stronger labor rights, higher regional content, tougher standards meant to protect American workers. But trade pacts have a way of rewriting themselves in practice, and what those rules actually did was set off a quiet wage war south of the border that neither side truly anticipated. Start with the numbers. For any passenger vehicle crossing duty-free into the U.S., at least 40% of its labor value content must be built by workers earning $16 an hour or more, 45% if it's a truck. The intent was clear: push automakers to keep higher wage production in the U.S. and Canada, or at least raise pay in Mexico so the playing field leveled out. On paper, it sounded like a moral upgrade to globalization. In practice, it drew a bright line between factories that could afford compliance and those that couldn't. When the rules took full effect in 2025, something remarkable happened. A handful of Mexican plants, mostly run by major multinationals, started paying closer to that threshold, creating an elite tier of auto workers earning several times the national average. Thousands received bonuses, back pay, and union recognition under new labor rights cases. The U.S. even set up a watchdog known as the Rapid Response Mechanism to enforce these standards. Between 2021 and mid-2025, Washington triggered 37 of those cases, most targeting auto plants accused of suppressing unions or underpaying staff. Roughly 70% ended in settlements favoring workers. For labor advocates, it was proof the system worked. But every victory came with collateral damage. Smaller suppliers, those producing seat frames, wiring harnesses, and dashboards, faced compliance costs they could barely absorb. To qualify for tariff-free status, they had to document pay rates, prove collective bargaining rights, and sometimes match the high-wage content quotas even when producing low-margin components. For firms operating on razor-thin spreads, the new oversight felt like a guillotine hovering over their accounting books. One supplier in Puebla put it bluntly: "If we meet all the rules, we price ourselves out. If we don't, we lose our biggest customers." Meanwhile, the very wage hikes meant to shrink the gap with the U.S. created a new internal divide in Mexico itself. Skilled auto technicians in certified facilities suddenly jumped into a different economic class, earning 4, sometimes 5 times more than workers in other manufacturing sectors. The factory floor that once bonded towns together began splitting them apart. Young workers chased the coveted $16 jobs, leaving smaller workshops struggling for staff. Economists started referring to it as the USMCA distortion. A regulation written to benefit North American fairness ended up redrawing Mexico's own labor hierarchy. Still, the macro results looked good. Mexico's automotive industry didn't shrink under these new pressures, it adapted. The Mexican Automotive Industry Association proudly predicted the country would become the fifth largest vehicle producer on Earth by the end of 2025, and the data backed it up. Production capacity kept expanding, wages climbed for those in compliance zones, and collectively, the sector gained political legitimacy it hadn't enjoyed since NAFTA's early years. The trade-off was complexity. The new paperwork burden grew so thick some companies hired entire departments just to handle certification proofs, audits, and cross-border coordination with labor monitors. At first, Washington hailed those complications as a price worth paying for higher standards. But inside the fine print lay another paradox. The more Mexico's labor costs rose to meet USMCA's benchmarks, the less the economic gap justified production moving south, at least for smaller manufacturers. To offset it, corporate planners doubled down on automation, using robotics and AI to maintain competitiveness while technically qualifying for higher labor value percentages. The spirit of the rule raising incomes was there. The letter of it, 40% high wage content, was met through algorithms instead of people. Behind closed doors, trade negotiators began admitting they'd underestimated how quickly Mexico would weaponize compliance. By creating pockets of high-pay, high-tech manufacturing, the country positioned itself as both rule follower and cost-advantageous partner. The duality was perfect. To Washington, Mexico appeared cooperative. To investors, it remained efficient. Each settlement under the rapid response mechanism became a headline proving moral progress, while downstream suppliers quietly automated or shifted non-compliant tasks into informal networks to survive. Diplomatically, everyone could claim victory. Economically, Mexico walked away as the winner. Yet not everyone applauded. U.S. labor unions pointed out that higher Mexican wages hadn't brought jobs back north, they just made Mexican exports more expensive and more advanced. Factories in Ohio or Illinois didn't reopen. Instead, new Mexican facilities incorporated better technology and kept running at competitive costs. The intended equilibrium never arrived. America got more oversight, not more employment. Mexico got both the raise and the manufacturing share. You can't reverse engineer patriotism through wage law, one union official muttered after an RRM settlement in Coahuila. For Mexican workers, though, the improvements were tangible and personal. Factory owners began allowing genuine union elections. Strikes led to renegotiated contracts without fear of blacklisting. Some facilities offered benefits packages unheard of before: childcare, educational stipends, even health insurance parity with U.S. plants. Workshops posted banners celebrating compliance audits the way tech companies announce product launches. Adhering to USMCA standards became a kind of branding, a label of reliability demanded by foreign clients. The unintended consequence: labor rights turned into a marketable commodity. Then came the anticipatory buzz of 2026. Under the treaty, any member nation could request a full review of the agreement 6 years after its start. Politicians in both Washington and Ottawa signaled they wanted to revisit the labor chapter, some to tighten enforcement, others to scale it back before costs outran benefits. Mexico braced for the renegotiation like a storm it couldn't avoid. Officials prepared data showing rising wages, improved conditions, and consistent compliance. Their message was simple: the model works, don't break what's finally fixing itself. But credibility cuts both ways. For every glowing progress chart, critics flashed another statistic: stagnant productivity, growing informal employment, uneven enforcement in smaller factories. Mexico could meet USMCA's letter but not its spirit uniformly. And yet any attempt by the US to punish non-compliance risked shuttering plants American supply chains couldn't live without. The interdependency that once seemed like friendship now felt like hostage logic. Because every audit, every wage threshold, every complaint filed through the rapid response mechanism landed on assets too crucial to sanction. What nobody fully admitted was that the 202 rewrite of North American trade had mutated into a guarantee of Mexico's indispensability. Labor reforms, meant to secure fair competition, became proof that production couldn't simply move back to Ohio or Alberta. The ecosystem was fused. Raise the bar too high and you push manufacturing out of reach even for Mexico. Lower it, and you lose the political justification for integration. So policymakers did what bureaucracies always do. They delayed, studied, and adjusted definitions until contradictions could live side by side. By late 2025, factory managers had stopped worrying about ideology and focused on pragmatism. Compliance became just another production metric, measured like output or quality rate. The labor inspectors were part of the background hum. The bigger picture was clearer than ever. The United States had succeeded in reforming labor standards abroad, but the reward was a neighbor now capable of producing high-value goods on its own terms. Mexico wasn't the underdog in need of oversight anymore. It had evolved into a rule-bound, audit-proof pillar of continental manufacturing. That transformation carried a quiet irony. In trying to make trade fair, America had standardized the very conditions that made Mexico powerful. Wage thresholds lifted skill standards, enforcement mechanisms gave legitimacy, rules of origin kept production regional. The US got its ethical victory, Mexico got its industrial maturity. And when the 2026 review arrives, one thing will be obvious. The partnership cost more than either side intended, but the price of dismantling it now would be far higher. The shockwave nobody predicted. By the end of 2025, something strange was happening to the charts in Washington. Mexico's export numbers were surging, line after line pointing upward, while China's output began to flatten. Treasury analysts dug through spreadsheets trying to explain it, expecting a temporary fluke. It was. The numbers were consistent across sectors: automotive, electronics, machinery. Mexico was quietly outpacing expectations so completely that even the cautious economists at the Federal Reserve had to admit the center of gravity had shifted, and it hadn't asked permission. The data told a story of acceleration. Manufacturing GDP in Mexico reached roughly 5.28 trillion pesos by mid-2025, a steady climb from the previous quarter despite global economic headwinds. Factories that once ran one shift now operated around the clock. In Guadalajara, export terminals overflowed with boxes stamped for American retailers. Monterrey's industrial districts glowed through the night as semiconductor subcontractors fed urgent orders from Texas. Near Juarez, the air smelled faintly of burnt metal and ozone from the automated welding lines producing frame assemblies for EVs. Even with minor dips in employment, Mexico's output kept rising, driven by reinvestment rather than fresh arrivals. That detail mattered. 80% of new foreign direct investment wasn't new corporations planting flags, it was existing ones doubling down. Companies already on-site saw no reason to gamble elsewhere. They were saving millions purely from location. One logistics analyst estimated that for every $100 million project, proximity to the US cut $5 to $7 million a year in transportation and inventory expenses. That arithmetic proved unstoppable. Meanwhile, China looked tired. Years of property market crises, demographic pressure, and political tension with Washington had dulled its sheen as the world's factory. American firms once fearful of leaving found themselves wooed by Mexican stability, not necessarily political calm but predictability. A steady peso, cooperative regulatory agencies, and a government willing to build infrastructure first and ask questions later. Ship a container from Shenzhen, it waits offshore. Truck one from Monterrey, it's at a Dallas warehouse before lunch the next day. Against that comparison, distance itself turned into a liability. Inside boardrooms, executives began using a new phrase, de-risking through proximity. It framed Mexico as not just a supplier but an insurance policy. A well-placed factory in Nuevo León bought peace of mind for companies rattled by 3 years of global volatility. The formula worked so reliably that analysts at DRZ Investments called Mexico the indispensable middle gear, too practical to replace and too close to ignore. And because the entire system operated under the legal umbrella of USMCA, it remained largely immune from the trade shocks that hit Asia. Financial markets noticed first. By the second half of 2025, Mexican industrial REITs like Vesta reported record occupancy, nearly every square meter leased to manufacturing expansion. Banks began bundling nearshoring exposure as a distinct asset class. Investors who once favored Shenzhen or Ho Chi Minh City now toured Monterrey. They came away with the same conclusion. Whatever turbulence rocked global trade, Mexico's integration with the US market functioned like ballast, keeping everything steady. On the ground, evidence was impossible to miss. Highways near Laredo groaned under endless convoys of semi-trailers. Customs brokers worked double shifts. The border, long treated as a political boundary, had become an economic bloodstream. Each crossing represented one more confirmation that the old global supply chain had reversed its direction. North America no longer imported its resilience, it manufactured it just south of the United States. Political rhetoric lagged behind. In Washington, leaders still spoke of bringing jobs home. They didn't realize they already had, just not to the same side of the border. Mexican towns that barely registered on American maps now determined production timelines for US megabrands. When a power outage hit Reynosa in early 2025, supply managers in Michigan felt the tremor within hours. That fragility unsettled the Department of Commerce, which started referring to Mexico as part of the domestic adjacent base. It sounded technical, it was code for dependence. At the same time, something subtler unfolded in speech and symbolism. Mexican news programs stopped describing their success as serving U.S. demand and started calling it partnership leadership. The tone shifted from pride to quiet assertion. Mexico wasn't pleading for relevance, it was defining it. President Sheinbaum used every major forum, from Davos panels to local industrial conferences, to emphasize cooperation built on complementarity, the idea that Mexico wasn't competing with America but completing it. Beneath the diplomacy lay a simple truth: completion meant indispensability. For American strategists conditioned to view manufacturing through the lens of rivalry, that realization was difficult to frame. This wasn't victory or defeat. It was absorption, an economic merger where one partner handled the design and branding while the other powered the physical heartbeat beneath it. The Made in Mexico label had become an invisible suffix to American corporate identity. Laptop casings, medical sensors, HVAC motors, everyday products now carried the fingerprint of joint creation. Consumers never saw it, but the dependency deepened with every purchase. Then came the external shock that proved how irreversible it all was. Late that summer, when Pacific shipping disruptions caused by a typhoon stranded dozens of vessels, global supply lines hiccuped again. But unlike 202 U.S. retailers stayed stocked. Warehouses in Texas and Arizona pulled directly from Mexican flow. Quarter after quarter, big box stores reported steady inventory levels. Economists realized they were witnessing something historic, a decoupling not from China in theory but in practice. Mexico had inherited the role without any grand proclamation, simply by never faltering when others did. Inside the White House, aides started describing the shift as the Mexican cushion. It nullified shocks and dampened inflationary ripples, yet the more Washington relied on that cushion, the less it could pressure Mexico politically. Tariffs, immigration disputes, or security disagreements all met the same quiet rebuttal. Interrupting trade meant sabotaging U.S. supply chains days before election season. Policymakers had maneuvered themselves into a dependency so intricate it functioned like mutual insurance. If Mexico stumbled, America fell. For Mexico, the payoff wasn't measured in rhetoric but resilience. During what analysts feared would be a slow year, its economy held steady against global stagnation. Exports offset weak domestic consumption, industrial electricity demand surged, and tax revenues from border states eclipsed projections. Economists who once dismissed Mexico as perennially underperforming now called it the shock absorber of globalization. The title fit: flexible enough to take impact yet crucial enough that everyone else depended on its elasticity. Still, there was an undercurrent of unease threading through both capitals. In Washington, lobbyists for labor unions warned that near might soon feel too far, that domestic industries were hollowing out even as the data looked prosperous. In Mexico City, economists cautioning against over-reliance on U.S. demand called for diversified trade routes into Europe and South America. Both sides sensed that balance teetering. What began as risk mitigation had evolved into structural codependence. No one could unwind it without triggering pain on both fronts. The moment of clarity came not with a headline but a realization shared by hundreds of CFOs staring at their quarterly reports. Shifting production to Mexico hadn't been a temporary patch, it had become the operating system. Every metric of efficiency, the savings, delivery times, risk indexes flowed through the same southern conduit. The United States, in seeking to insulate itself from chaos, had hardwired that insulation into someone else's economy. And so the shockwave wasn't a market crash or a political scandal. It was a new normal taking shape so quietly that by the time analysts named it, it was already irreversible. American resilience had changed addresses. Mexican industry had become the failsafe of the Western Hemisphere. And as both nations congratulated themselves on surviving another turbulent year, one question lingered in the data, unspoken but undeniable. If stability now depends on what happens south of the border, whose economy is really steering North America's future? The coming clash: tariffs, politics, and dependency. By early 2026, the illusion of harmony began to unravel. North America's supply chain machine was still humming, but the politics around it had turned toxic. On campaign stages across the United States, candidates from both parties discovered there were votes to be won in shouting about lost control. Factories moving south became shorthand for betrayal. Border cooperation turned into suspicion. Then, in one abrupt announcement, the quiet integration of two economies collided with the loud theater of election season. Former President Trump stepped back into the spotlight and declared a sweeping 30% tariff on Mexican imports, citing border security failures. The move was designed for applause lines, not policy coherence. Within hours, markets trembled until the fine print emerged. The tariff exempted all goods compliant with the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. That single clause changed everything. Roughly 80% of bilateral trade instantly dodged the blow. The penalty sounded severe but landed like a slap across water. loud, showy, and mostly harmless. Still, the optics stung. Washington's message was clear. Political theater would always trump economic logic. In Mexico City, President Sheinbaum's administration responded carefully, neither condemning nor capitulating. They knew the balance sheet favored them. U.S. manufacturers depended too heavily on Mexican suppliers for any tariff to be more than symbolic. Diesel engines built in Nuevo Leon-powered tractors in Iowa, medical equipment from Guadalajara stocked hospitals in Florida. Stopping that flow would punish American voters before Mexican ones. Behind closed doors, Mexican officials almost pitied the spectacle. American pundits missed the deeper irony. The USMCA, the very trade deal Trump had championed and branded the best ever, now shielded Mexico from his own economic aggression. Legal frameworks he once hailed as triumphs of sovereignty had become handcuffs limiting leverage. Each attempt to strong-arm Mexico ricocheted against the architecture of interdependence the U.S. itself had built. The result, a display of power that revealed only weakness. Yet beneath the rhetoric, pressure accumulated. Labor unions lobbied Congress to revisit the agreement's wage clauses. National security committees warned about over-reliance on foreign assembly lines. Economists countered that tariffs would only accelerate inflation. The debate wasn't really about trade anymore. It was about identity, whether the U.S. could still call itself an industrial superpower when the hardware of its prosperity was manufactured a few hundred miles south. In response, policy advisors floated new classifications for strategic industries, sectors supposedly too critical to outsource even to allies. The idea sounded reassuring until analysts mapped which industries that covered. Semiconductors, auto parts, batteries, advanced electronics, all were already deeply entangled in Mexico. Any repatriation would take years and cost billions. Legislators knew it, so the definitions remained abstract. They spoke of national renewal while signing off on procurement pipelines still anchored in Monterrey and Tijuana. The speeches said independence, the spreadsheets whispered dependency. At the same time, the border's daily rhythms told a different story, one of continuity. Despite the headline tariffs, freight traffic through Laredo hit record highs. U.S. Customs officers processed truck convoys day and night. Retailers couldn't afford moral posturing, they needed inventory on shelves. In effect, business ignored politics and pushed integration forward on autopilot. Every delivery confirmed the same paradox: confrontation at the podium, collaboration in the warehouse. Inside U.S. think tanks, the phrase vulnerability through proximity began circulating. Strategists realized Mexico's leverage wasn't theoretical. If trade routes halted even briefly, assembly plants across the Midwest would fall idle within a week. A single customs bottleneck could ripple through sectors worth hundreds of billions. The proximity that once promised safety now looked like exposure to elections, diplomacy, and personality politics. Supply chains had chained themselves to the whims of campaign rhetoric. Meanwhile, Mexico played the long game. President Sheinbaum used American turbulence as proof of her government's steadiness. She balanced cooperation on border enforcement with firm defense of trade continuity, knowing every act of restraint increased investor confidence. Even the fentanyl crackdown, which saw smuggling down nearly 40%, doubled as economic diplomacy. She framed it not just as law enforcement, but as evidence Mexico could handle shared responsibility. Each concession bought goodwill from Washington while protecting trade access. On Wall Street, analysts started describing Mexico as a hedge against U.S. politics themselves. The irony was brutal. Foreign investors saw Mexican assets as safer than American supply chains subject to election cycles. Capital flowed accordingly. Industrial REITs near Monterrey appreciated while U.S. manufacturers paused expansions at home, uncertain which promises from Washington would survive the next administration. Economic gravity didn't care about slogans. Inside Congress, bipartisan anxiety grew over the upcoming 2026 USMCA review. Democrats wanted even stricter labor and environmental clauses. Republicans threatened tougher origin rules to block Chinese participation. Both agendas sounded patriotic, but both risked detonating the framework that kept inflation tame. Negotiators whispered that any major rewrite could trigger retaliatory tariffs, legal challenges, or corporate abandonment. The tightrope stretched thinner with each proposal. For Mexican policymakers, that looming review wasn't a threat, it was leverage. By emphasizing successful compliance with labor standards and emissions targets, they positioned Mexico as the responsible partner in an unstable trio. Canadian officials quietly agreed, continental prosperity depended on continuity more than pride. The subtext in every trilateral meeting was the same: no one can afford to break this. Mexico understood the psychology perfectly and responded with calm pragmatism each time Washington flared. When asked whether they feared new tariffs, one trade official smiled. "They're already buying, that's all we need to know." On the ground, factories kept delivering. American automakers unveiled new EV lines built in North America, omitting that most components came from plants across the border. Consumers didn't care, supply returned, prices stabilized. The integrated system survived another political storm, but every cycle of attack and accommodation etched the dependency deeper. The US discovered it could bluster indefinitely precisely because Mexico absorbed the impact. Stability outsourced is still stability, at least until the next shock. Journalists covering the 2026 campaign compared the situation to the energy crises of the 197s, except this time the OPEC states were replaced by an industrial neighbor bound by geography and treaties. America's vulnerability wasn't across oceans anymore. It sat on the same continent, smiling behind handshake diplomacy. That realization unsettled even the optimists, because unlike oil, manufacturing interdependence couldn't simply be diversified away. To replace Mexico, the US would have to rebuild an entire continental backbone. No candidate could promise that honestly. So the tariff war fizzled into symbolism, another chapter in America's recurring ritual of economic anxiety. After each round of threats, new exceptions carved the tariffs hollow. Lobbyists secured carve-outs, governors begged for exemptions to protect dependent industries in their own states. By autumn, the 30% measure had dwindled to a marginal 5% surcharge on non-compliant imports, barely noticeable in consumer prices. The spectacle ended as quietly as it began. But for those watching the deeper currents, the episode revealed something irreversible. Mexico wasn't the passive junior partner Washington imagined. It had evolved into the stabilizer of North American capitalism. Every policy aimed at disciplining it now confirmed its necessity. The battlefield shifted from tariffs to trust. Could the US tolerate being reliant on a neighbor it couldn't easily pressure? Could Mexico manage growing responsibility without provoking backlash? As winter approached, the answer emerged not from speeches but from data. Cross-border trade volumes hit new records, even as political rhetoric reached new decibels. The louder the fight, the more activity surged. Dependency had become self-sustaining, indifferent to ideology. America's industrial pulse now beat in rhythm with Mexican production schedules, not congressional calendars. And though no politician would admit it, the continent's future stability rested on a quiet truth whispered through every idling truck queue at the border. When supply and politics collide, production wins. Mexico's quiet confidence. By 2026, the noise of crisis had faded, replaced by something steadier, an almost eerie composure radiating from Mexico City. While Washington fretted over tariffs and election polls, Mexico projected calm. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. A nation long defined by its dependence on the North now moved with the assurance of one that understood its own indispensability. What looked like compromise from the outside was, in truth, strategy, pragmatism masquerading as politeness. President Claudia Sheinbaum embodied that tone. Her speeches lacked the theatrical barbs that defined past administrations. She didn't need them. Every data chart, every factory output report, and every new industrial zone breaking ground told the story for her. Mexico's economy wasn't booming by luck, it was being managed into maturity. And the message sent to neighbors and investors alike was deliberate. You can trust stability dressed in humility. Her government's diplomacy favored balance over confrontation. Rather than railing against Trump's tariffs or demanding concessions, Sheinbaum's team quietly expanded cooperation on border enforcement and drug trafficking. The numbers spoke louder than any press conference. Fentanyl seizures down 40%, homicide rates ticking lower, border crossers processed with new biometric systems co-funded by US aid. Every pragmatic gesture built credibility, each one strengthening Mexico's moral leverage against unpredictable northern politics. Washington noticed, grudgingly. At home, she launched Plan Mexico, branding it not as economic policy but as nation-building through industrialization. The blueprint carved 15 tax-incentivized corridors across the country, each aligned with a strategic sector. Automotive along the northeast, aerospace through the Baggio, electronics in Jalisco, renewables in Oaxaca, logistics hubs linking Veracruz and Monterrey. The initiative promised to double clean energy generation by 203, modernize grid capacity, and fast-track infrastructure permits that once buried investors in red tape. It sold efficiency as patriotism. Every groundbreaking ceremony became a confidence signal. Drone footage circulated of solar arrays outside Hermosillo, wind farms in Tamaulipas powering automated factories, and container yards near León expanding twice their previous size. Global investors saw a pattern: political neutrality fused with developmental aggression. Mexico was no longer competing with its neighbors on cheap labor. It was redefining competitiveness as competence. That evolution ran on brains as much as concrete. Universities responded to demand with programs tailored to the nearshoring wave. Mechanical engineering tracks in Monterrey focused on automation design. Electronics institutes in Guadalajara partnering with Siemens and Jabil. Aerospace certification programs in Querétaro run jointly with Canadian schools. Every year, 125,000 new engineers join the domestic labor pool. For a generation once told to seek opportunity abroad, the map had flipped. The future was at home, and it spoke both Spanish and English. Inside corporate campuses, foreign managers began noticing a shift in attitude. Mexican engineers no longer approached meetings as subcontractors asking for approval. They arrived as collaborators negotiating terms. Local startups sprouted around industrial clusters, developing software for predictive maintenance, robotics calibration, and logistics analytics. The old dream of being the world's workshop was quietly morphing into something bigger, designing the tools the world would use next. Emerging hubs demonstrated how quickly this identity could scale. Guadalajara and Monterrey led in electronics and automation, but new contenders like San Luis Potosi and Chihuahua added layers of specialization: battery components, renewable energy gear, biotech manufacturing. Mexico City, once dismissed as too bureaucratic for industry, reinvented zones on its outskirts into R&D corridors linked directly to global supply networks. The result was a mosaic of innovation connected by highways, data lines, and ambition. You could sense the character of this transformation in small details. Young technicians commuting to smart factories in León spoke with pride about working for Tesla suppliers rather than dreaming of visas. Cafes around Monterrey filled with entrepreneurs pitching logistics platforms instead of real estate schemes. Middle-class families, long living on remittances from relatives in Texas, now earned steady paychecks from plants serving those same relatives' employers. The direction of dependency had reversed, and with it, a shift in self-image that no diplomatic communique could articulate. President Sheinbaum's cabinet used this momentum to recalibrate Mexico's foreign posture. Gone were the days of reactionary nationalism or defensive trade rhetoric. Every meeting with US or Canadian counterparts was choreographed around partnership language, interdependence, regional stability, shared prosperity. Yet the subtext stretched deeper. Mexico didn't need to demand respect anymore, it simply operated as if it already had it. The calm tone itself became a tool of power. Energy policy amplified that stance. Doubling clean capacity by 203 wasn't just environmental signaling, it was strategic leverage. Manufacturing clients increasingly demanded low-carbon supply chains. By positioning its grid as the greenest in the hemisphere, Mexico offered what neither the US nor Canada could promise at scale: guilt-free industrial output, one truck ride away from the world's largest consumer base. European automakers and tech firms lined up for agreements, treating Mexico as a springboard for decarbonized exports into North America. Clean energy turned geography into ideology. Meanwhile, central banks and investors noticed a subtle convergence. Inflation cooled faster in Mexico than in most peer economies, partly because export demand soaked up volatility. The peso stabilized, FDI inflows kept breaking records. Bloomberg analysts started referring to Mexico's market as the calm amid Western noise. It wasn't overperformance, it was predictability rewarded. That aura fed back into politics. Pragmatic leadership became a competitive asset, not a compromise. Among ordinary Mexicans, pride replaced cynicism. Infrastructure projects long dismissed as fantasies expanded, rail corridors, modern ports, and new energy lines actually broke ground. Domestic media began referring to the manufacturing republic, half in admiration, half disbelief. For the first time in decades, Mexico's national narrative joined ambition with execution. The results materialized not in grand speeches, but in distribution metrics, factory output graphs, and salary slips thicker than before. To outsiders, the transformation looked almost apolitical, but that was its genius. Mexico's confidence didn't roar, it resonated. Every pragmatic concession to US security demands bought another year of industrial momentum. Every compliance tweak to USMCA reinforced credibility with investors. Power accrued quietly, layered like sediment, until one morning policymakers north of the border realized their neighbors' deference had been replaced by discretion. International forums reflected the shift. At trade summits, Mexican delegates stopped asking for inclusion on panels, they hosted them. European ministers courting Latin American partnerships found themselves routing discussions through Mexico first. Sheinbaum's government positioned the nation as the interlocutor between hemispheres, fluent in North American regulation yet culturally aligned with emerging markets. The bridge metaphor that once described vulnerability had become a throne. And here lies the quiet paradox of modern Mexico. Its strength thrives on moderation. No revolutions televised, no fiery denunciations, no claims of destiny, just a methodical expansion of capacity and competence, punctuated by diplomatic stillness. America debates whether it's losing influence. Mexico acts as if it's already carrying the weight that influence left behind. Every smooth border crossing, every stable shipment, every energy project fulfilled reinforces the same idea, that continuity itself is the new currency of power. For Washington, that realization lands uncomfortably. The neighbor it once viewed as a production base now behaves like a stakeholder shaping the terms of regional stability. In global discussions on climate, migration, or trade, Mexico no longer echoes US talking points, it edits them. The leverage isn't loud, but it's permanent. Because when your factories, your supply chains, and your inflation targets depend on another country's steadiness, that steadiness becomes authority. And authority, as Mexico quietly discovered, rarely needs to announce itself. It simply stands still while others oscillate. As long as the machines keep humming in Monterrey and the trucks keep rolling through Laredo, silence remains its loudest statement, a form of confidence so measured it feels inevitable. America's new dependency. By the time 2027 arrived, the shape of North American power had flipped without ceremony. Supply chains that once fanned outward across oceans now stretched vertically along the latitude lines of the continent, binding two nations together in a relationship neither could afford to sever. For decades, America had thought of Mexico as an accessory, a convenient workshop for cheap assembly. Suddenly, it was the indispensable organ that kept the body alive. The metaphor had changed. The supply chain no longer ran east toward Asia. It pulsed north, feeding the United States from below like a hidden artery. Inside distribution centers from Houston to Chicago, the evidence was stacked on every pallet. Auto parts stamped in Guanajuato, electronics boxed in Guadalajara, even hospital equipment and solar inverters bore markings traceable to northern Mexican hubs. Economists started joking grimly that the US didn't import goods anymore, it imported uptime. Every delay south of Brownsville now determined whether American factories met quarterly targets. The dependency wasn't philosophical, it was mechanical. In Washington, officials downplayed it as regional integration. But beyond the euphemisms, nervous memos circulated warning that industrial autonomy had quietly eroded. 90 days of disruption in Mexico, one report estimated, would paralyze up to half of US manufacturing output. That figure wasn't speculation, it came from modeling real procurement data. The old chain of command had reversed. American factories were waiting on decisions made in Mexican plants, not the other way around. The danger wasn't that Mexico would exploit this. It was that America could no longer function independently of it. Political rhetoric about bringing jobs home sounded hollow when every homegrown assembly line still needed parts trucked across the Rio Grande. Even defense contractors sourcing specialized components for aircraft and communications systems admitted their suppliers operated under the Mexican sun. Strategic autonomy had become an accounting illusion, signed off each quarter to reassure investors. The dependence radiated into infrastructure. U.S. railroads adapted timetables around Mexican shipping schedules. Border states invested billions upgrading inspection ports purely to keep goods flowing faster north. An entire logistics economy evolved to lubricate this relationship. Refrigerated trucks, cross-dock facilities, bilingual dispatch systems, customs brokers working 24-hour rotations. None of it belonged exclusively to one country anymore. It was an ecosystem fused by necessity. Everyone benefited until someone asked who actually held the off switch. Analysts at the Brookings Institution phrased it starkly. If Mexico suffered a major grid failure or coordinated labor strike, critical U.S. sectors would halt within 72 hours. The model predicted cascading shortages, automobiles first, then electronics, then energy hardware. The same interdependence that once promised stability now carried the seeds of collective vulnerability. Mexico understood this better than anyone. Officials rarely mentioned leverage publicly, but in private meetings they framed reliability as currency. You can't price trust, one trade official said with a shrug, and yet they all pay for it. He wasn't exaggerating. American corporations signed long-term service agreements with Mexican suppliers, shifting risk management southward. Insurance companies recalibrated models to reflect lower delay probabilities for Mexican routes than for Pacific shipping lanes. The idea of diversification had inverted. Distance equaled danger. Meanwhile, social change followed the economics. Middle-class families in Texas and California realized their paychecks depended indirectly on Mexican stability. Retail, construction, and service industries drew income from products born in Mexican plants. A disruption in Saltillo could mean layoffs in Seattle. The border that once symbolized separation had become a conveyor belt of codependence, linking prosperity on both sides in a loop that couldn't be untangled without mutual pain. Yet the political language lagged decades behind the reality it described. Campaigns still sold the fantasy of independence, as if reshoring were one decision away. No one wanted to say aloud that America's manufacturing rebirth existed only because of Mexico's endurance. The optics of reliance grated against national pride. So speeches talked of partnership, cooperation, and friend-shoring, soft synonyms concealing an uncomfortable truth. America had outsourced resilience itself. Inside factories north of the border, managers began noticing how quietly that dynamic shaped daily life. When a shipment delay occurred, calls went south first. Mexican engineers decided when to resume production, how to reroute materials, which ports to prioritize. Those weren't coordination calls, they were deferrals of control. The balance of decision-making had migrated, powered by expertise as much as infrastructure. And because the system functioned flawlessly, nobody up top had incentive to question who was truly steering. Economists drew parallels to the energy crisis of the 197s when the US first learned what dependence felt like. Then it was oil. Now it was manufacturing capacity. The difference was proximity. There were no tankers crossing oceans, just a constant flow of trucks humming across 60 official border points. The line separating producer and consumer blurred until it existed mainly on maps and in political rhetoric. American vulnerability wasn't limited to goods. Knowledge transfer followed production. Engineering databases, quality control protocols, and design adaptation skills all migrated south with the factories. Mexican technicians became gatekeepers of the very systems that once defined American reliability. In time, they weren't just executing plans, they were improving them. This intellectual inversion ensured that even if production someday returned north, expertise would still flow from south to north. Corporate boards tried to rationalize the shift. Annual reports praised regional synergy and bimodal supply optimization. Investors liked the phrasing. It sounded modern, not dependent. But the more integrated operations became, the less movable they were. A contract signed for cost savings in 2023 had become an anchor by 2027. Breaking it would be like amputating part of the economy to reclaim independence that no longer existed in practice. Among policymakers, whispers of contingency planning circulated. What if border politics froze trade or infrastructure collapsed under demand? Risk analysts proposed redundant routes through ports on the Gulf, even experimental air cargo systems. None were realistic at continental scale. Geography had beaten ideology. Every kilometer of shared frontier reinforced what economists called the irreversibility factor. Once two systems synchronize production cycles, separation costs grow exponentially. Across Mexico, that awareness bred a new sense of responsibility mingled with quiet pride. Newspapers carried stories of technicians in Monterrey rushing overnight repairs to keep U.S. plants online. Truck drivers boasted of keeping America running. It wasn't arrogance, it was acknowledgement. They knew their labor now underpinned an empire of consumption that could no longer afford to look down on them. Interdependence had rewritten hierarchy. Still, the psychological split persisted in Washington. Dependence on China could be criticized as strategic folly. Dependence on Mexico had to be ignored to maintain the illusion of sovereignty. Officials spoke of shared growth, while internal audits mapped exposure zones so dense they resembled circulatory diagrams. The subtext gnawed at them. How does a superpower remain one when its industrial lifeline crosses someone else's customs lane? That question hung over every trade summit, every renegotiation draft, every tariff debate. Mexico didn't demand dominance, it simply demonstrated competence, and that competence became command. Step by step, North America's old hierarchy inverted not through rebellion but through reliability. The US hadn't been defeated, it had been absorbed into an ecosystem calibrated for mutual survival. In the end, the dependency looked deceptively peaceful. No ships sunk, no factories expropriated, no manifestos proclaimed. Just endless convoys, synchronized databases, and economic gravity doing what gravity does, pulling mass toward stability. America's industrial heartbeat now echoed the rhythm of Mexican shifts changing at dawn. And as both nations congratulated themselves on integration, the underlying truth settled quietly in logistics reports. The world's largest economy now ran on someone else's timetable. The quiet replacement. It didn't happen with fanfare. No flag lowered, no anthem replaced, just numbers shifting in spreadsheets until the geography of power realigned itself. When historians look back, they won't find a single event marking America's replacement. They'll find a gradient, a slow eclipse disguised as cooperation. Mexico didn't conquer anything. It inherited a role the United States quietly outsourced to build the tangible world that Americans still believed they made. The irony is elegant. For generations, U.S. leaders spoke about deglobalization, reshoring, self-reliance. They built policies to reclaim control from Asia. But the system never came home, it moved closer. Nearshoring was the polite word for substitution. Every company that shifted production south to protect American interests planted the infrastructure of a successor state, one connected by rail and truck routes instead of ideology. The future of North American power started not in Washington think tanks, but in Reynosa shipping yards. By 2027, the continental blueprint was clear. Mexico manufactured affordability and stability. America consumed both and called it victory. The partnership felt natural, even desirable, until you realized who bore the weight of necessity. The economic umbilical cord that ran along the Rio Grande no longer fed Mexico's hopes. It pumped life into American industries that couldn't survive without it. Dependence once meant weakness for the South, now it defined the North. That shift didn't break the alliance, it cemented it. The United States gained a mirror image, a democratic neighbor producing at scale, politically aligned, linguistically compatible, geographically inevitable. For Washington, that should have been the dream scenario, but dreams turn to discomfort when the reflection stares back with competence. Mexico's rise wasn't a rebellion against American dominance, it was proof that regional logic eventually outruns national pride. And here's the unsettling part: nothing about it looks temporary. Cost differentials may narrow, technologies may evolve, but physical proximity doesn't expire. Whether it's electric vehicles, microchips, or renewable energy hardware, the most reliable production base for the US sits just beyond its southern border. The map has locked the equation in place. Mexico equals continuity. America equals consumption. The symmetry works until consumption begins to wobble. When that day comes and analysts whisper it's inevitable, the transfer of momentum will finish the story. A slowdown in US demand would no longer crush Mexico, it would merely shift markets eastward and southward. Factories that learn to supply Detroit can retool for Sao Paulo or Berlin. The very resilience built on US dependence now grants autonomy. If America falters, Mexico stands ready not as a victim, but as an alternative. The question is whether Washington realizes that before it happens. Every transformation leaves a signature, and this one hums faintly across industrial corridors from Monterrey to Monterey County in California. Forklifts roll, machines synchronize, databases sync cross-border in real time. The sound isn't victory or loss, it's equilibrium settling into place. No treaties needed rewriting, no wars fought, no flags burned, just a mathematical truth asserting itself. Capital flows toward competence. In this era, competence speaks Spanish. Look closely at the new order and you'll notice how gracefully history disguised the transition. The logos on products remain American, the financial flows still clear through New York banks, the political speeches still mention shared prosperity. Yet the pulse beneath belongs elsewhere. Mexico built the skeleton of North America's future while the United States argued about who deserved credit for its bones. That's not deception, that's evolution without permission. For Mexico, the challenge now is stewardship. Power gained quietly must be maintained quietly. Stability becomes the new revolution. The country that once measured itself through its diaspora must now measure itself through discipline, keeping factories efficient, energy clean, and politics dull. Because the only thing more powerful than surprise ascent is sustained reliability. So long as the lights stay on in Mexican plants, the empire next door remains half dependent, half grateful, entirely unaware of how much of its certainty belongs to someone else. For America, the reckoning arrives in subtler ways. Policymakers speak of competitiveness while drafting budgets whose stability depends on foreign manufacturing taxes. Labor leaders demand reshoring without admitting the macroeconomics forbid it. Citizens buy goods stamped with a heritage they no longer own. Each contradiction adds weight to the quiet replacement underway, a shift of function, not flag, where endurance counts more than ambition. The phrase "made in Mexico" used to elicit skepticism. Now it elicits relief. It guarantees shelves stay stocked, assembly lines stay fed, inflation stays tame. Somewhere in that convenience hides the story of empire through logistics, a superpower unseated by a trade network rather than a rival army. The most powerful nation on earth didn't lose leadership. It lent it indefinitely to the partner that could keep producing when global chaos returned. When you trace the arc from that silent Detroit factory floor to today's humming plants in Monterrey, the pattern resolves: replacement by proximity. A continent reorganized not by ideology but by geography's patience. Mexico didn't overthrow America. America outsourced its throne piece by piece until the final screw tightened itself. And because no one announced the coronation, no one feels dethroned. So what remains? Concern, mostly concern that the American century ended not in conflict but in outsourcing contracts. Concern that North America's resilience rests on politics it barely influences. Concern that the next global crisis will reveal how far the shift has gone. Yet alongside that worry runs a quieter acknowledgement, even admiration, for the neighbor that stepped up when the world fractured. If power is defined by who sustains civilization when everything else fails, then North America already answered that test during the last decade's storms. The results are empirical. The hum that saved the continent of consumption came from assembly lines south of the border. That hum hasn't stopped. It doesn't need speeches or slogans or declarations. It just needs to keep running. And as long as it does, the balance of this hemisphere belongs to the country that never asked for it, but built it anyway. Because the truth is simple and maybe a little painful, Mexico didn't steal America's power. America delivered it boxed, labeled, tariff compliant on the next outgoing truck. The replacement wasn't loud, but it was thorough. The factories knew it first. The data confirmed it next. The politics will catch up last. And when they finally do, they'll discover the center of gravity in North America has already shifted, quietly, permanently southward.